Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak about my book, which you can see the cover of here. I got into this through genealogy. I'm sure a lot of you, I understand, have an interest in genealogy. And it's grown and grown until I had a family tree with 15,000 people on it. And that began to turn into an interest in the history of those people. So this talk tonight, what I'm going to cover is the record that was made of a conversation in November 1825, so over 200 years ago. The contents of the book that I've written about that conversation, who the participants were, the Rangatira involved and the missionaries, and then I want to talk about some key passages from the conversation that I think give you the flavour of what was actually happening in this encounter. Oops. Here we go. Press the wrong button. And then I'll just end up with a talk about the context of what was actually happening in 1825 up in Kerikeri in the north. So Richard Davis recorded, while it was happening, this amazing discussion that happened between the Rangatira and the missionaries. And it was first published in 1865, after he died. A chap back in England collected all his papers together and put it into a book. And it has been published again by a descendant of Hongi in her biography of Hongi. You can see here where he recorded the names of the chiefs that were involved. Shongi, which is the way they transcribe the name Hongi, Hongi Hika, Rewa, Titori, Hihi, Uroa, Pakida and Tinana. And I don't know if you can see there, but you can see there and there the macrons. So they were using macrons to record how you pronounce the names of those Rangatira, way back in 1825. So it's nothing new. And I think it's a very interesting indication of how respect was being shown by the missionaries to the Rangatira in a very direct way. If you take care on how you pronounce somebody's name, they recognise that as respect. So what are the contents of this book that I've written? Well, it comes in sort of three parts. There's the layers of history, and I talk about what Maori warfare was actually like, and I talk about warfare and peacemaking, and a bit about Hongi Hika himself and his relationship to the Church Missionary Society. And then the hui, who the participants were, who said what, and it ends up, the final section is on in conclusions. So I don't come to any hard and fast conclusions about what it all meant. But I think as you go through it, you pick up what was happening. And an end, that when Hongi died, he specifically said to his descendants to take care of the praying people, because they were the ones who had been kind to him. And that changed the nature of the relationship between the Pākehā and Maori at that point. So I think it's quite significant. And I'll talk a bit more about why the Te Inui a Te Ariki, that's the Lord's Prayer, why that features as we go on. So who is involved in this conversation? Hongi Hika. Now this is a portrait, self-portrait that Hongi had carved when he was visiting Samuel Marsden over in Parramatta in 1814. And Samuel Marsden gave him 3 gum fence posts and a hoop from a barrel, and Hongi turned it into a knife and carved this very accurate portrayal of his facial moku. And he did 3 of them. One of them got sent back to England and featured on the missionary circular to illustrate who they were dealing with, the fearsome nature of these rangatira. So there was Hongi Hika, Rewa, who was from Kirikiri, Uraroa, who was from up Whangaroa. You might recognise that name. It's to Uraroa Flavel, uses this, the descendant. Hihi, who in 1824 asked D'Urville had visited Bay of Islands and noticed this amazingly strong and tall chief who unfortunately died much later. Titori, who had also visited England, and Tanana from Waimati and Pakira. And Titori had visited London in 1818 and was painted for the Missionary Society. And Hongi and Waikato had visited London in 1820 and again had been painted. And so you get some impression of what these guys looked like, the kind of bearing they had. And Hongi, of course, was a hugely famous person throughout New Zealand, and Marsden related strongly to him, and Hongi was sort of the protector of the missionaries. And if you ever go up the Kerikeri Inlet and the winding river that gets eventually to the stone store, you realise he'd tucked them away in this well-protected little enclave that no one else could get in there without his pa seeing who was coming. So he's a very interesting character. The more I've read about him, the more I'm fascinated by the quality of his mind, as we will see as we go through some of the passages. And then some of the other rangatira. This was a drawing done in 1846 by a guy, Bambridge, who was a very good artist. And we've got here Rewa, Nene, that's Tamati Waka Nene, Thomas Walker Nene. And there's a photo of Nene that you can find, and you can see that the similarity, that he's got a very good likeness in this portrait. And this is Hakiro. I'm not sure that this isn't Pakira, another name for, or another spelling of the name Pakira. So again, you begin to see the personalities that we're dealing with here in these portraits.
Excuse me, were those portraits done in New Zealand?
Yes. Yes.
They were done in New Zealand?
Yes. William Bainbridge came out with Selwyn, and he did those. I think there'd been a meeting of the Rangatira, and he sat them down and drew a picture of it. And the missionaries, people recognise this character. This is Karuwha, Four Eyes, Henry Williams, who was an English, he'd been in the Navy, he'd fought at the Battle of Copenhagen with Nelson. He knew what blood and guts looked like from English warfare, from naval battles, splinters and cannon and the nasty outcomes of warfare. And so he was a pretty strong pacifist, and he was quite keen that Maori should give up warfare. And so he called this meeting to try and dissuade Rangatira from taking their people off to battle. So it was Henry Williams, George Clark, James Kemp, and Richard Davis, and William Gilbert Paki. And these last two are my ancestors. William Gilbert Pucky is my grandmother's grandfather, and Richard Davis was his father-in-law, because William Gilbert married Matilda Davis, who was Richard Davis' second daughter. And that's what James Kemp looked like. That's William Gilbert Pucky, Richard Davis, and there's George Clark surrounded by his large family. All the missionaries seem to have very large families.
No TV.
So, talking about the content and the process and the translation of these key passages, one of the reasons I wrote this book was that Dame Joan Match, had written, or had given evidence at the Murawhenua Land Claims Tribunal in 1994, where she said that William Pucky was a bit of a clumsy translator, and I don't think that's the case. I think he was actually a very, very skilled translator. And some of these passages might help illustrate that. So there's one about, after they've been talking about education, there's mention of the gentlemanship of the English. Now, have you ever heard the word gentlemanship before? Or since? That's a very strange word. And when I came across that, I happened to be in the reading room at the Alexander Turnbull Library, and the chap, Samuel Carpenter, was there, and I showed him this. He says, "Oh, gentlemanship, that's a very interesting word. I wonder if that's Rangatiratanga." And that's where we got the clue as to what that was about. There was a stage where Henry Williams was growling these Rangatira quite badly, saying, I'll come to that. And there's a thing about jumping from the precipice, a thing about Charlie, who's Hongi Hika's son, who had been killed in battle not long before. And then at the end, Henry Williams is talking about the vessel that he was building at Paihia, the Herald. I'll talk about that. So, the first passage, Henry Williams had been talking about how the gentlemen in England who are most familiar with the book, i.e. the Bible, were the most respected of men. And Hongi turns to the other Rangatira and says, as an aside really, but William Gilbert Pucky picks it up. He hears it and he translates it to the other missionaries. And so Shongi says, "Kahoe te Rangatiratanga o te iwi Pakeha, e take mai ana I o rato matua tupuna, inare, I to rato matoranga." And Pucky translates this to the missionaries as, the gentlemanship of the English is not altogether derived from their forefathers, but from their great learning. And he'd been to London, he'd met gentlemen, he'd been taken to Cambridge University and helped work on the dictionary that Kendall had started on. But I thought, this is a very sophisticated use of language. This is not altogether derived, it's a fine distinction he's making. And this word gentlemanship sticks out. I've never heard that word before. And so we've realised actually he was relating what he'd seen in England, and he was using a Maori word that matched it. And the interesting thing about this is that William Gilbert Pucky is busy in little committees that having each day to try and translate parts of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. And they come to this phrase in the Lord's Prayer where he says, "Thy kingdom come." And there's no word for kingdom in Te Rao. There's no king in New Zealand at that stage. So Pucky plucks this word Rangatiratanga and puts it into the Lord's Prayer for kingdom, for how the community is governed. And I think that's the source of this word. And of course, later on, Henry Williams uses it in the treaty. So it's quite a significant meeting. And then I say, the conversation moves on, and Henry Williams is giving the Rangatira a big growling. He's saying, look, we've given you all these axes, and what have you done with them? They're all gone, and we've given you this powder, and it's just turned into smoke, and you know, what's going on? He gives them a really good telling off. And he says, e pehe ana koto kupua yamato, ka hore koto e tuku waki, a mato ki te hakatokoto I a mato korero. And Paki translates this back to the, as saying, your words press us down. You do not give us time to speak for ourselves. Now that is an amazing thing, because in this conversation, this is a process statement. This stops them. Oh, we can't tell you guys off anymore. Oh, we have to start justifying ourselves. And it moves into Henry Williams talking about how they have taught their children and so on. And what we then get is a complete shift in the power balance in this group. All of a sudden, it's not the missionaries talking down to the Rangatira, it's the Rangatira standing or sitting there firm and saying, you can't talk to us like that. Right? And from then on, the conversation changes quite remarkably. You need to read the book to get the full detail. And then there was a point where the missionaries saying, are you sure that neither of you here present will be killed if you go to fight? They're trying to say, don't go to war. And Tony says, can you tell which of us will be killed? He's a bit of a prophet himself. He's wondering, do these guys have some special knowledge? And Henry Williams says, no, but in going to war, do you not rush, as it were, into the arms of death, as from a frightful precipice? And Shongi says, this is Greek tragedy, this is Homeric in its quality. He says, a man that hath a large loving heart for his friends who have been killed will bid the world farewell and jump from the precipice. And it's a very staunch statement, a very, this is Maori values spoken in full power. But it's hubristic, because he's lost his son earlier in the year, in May in the year. This is November. And I suddenly realised one night, I woke up in the morning with the recognition that Hongi actually had quite a lot of English. So when he was hearing Paki translate his words in Maori into English, he was hearing it back. He was hearing his own words reflected back to him. And in my training, that's counselling. That's reflecting. And it changed Hongi's psychic state. And shortly after this conversation, he goes and sees George Clark and says, have you got Hare's jacket, red jacket? And they bring it out from the back room, and he cries over it. And I'm pretty sure that's when Hongi recognised the weakness of his traditional stance. So the missionaries say, we are much grieved on the account of the death of Charlie and others. It grieved us very much to see their bones brought back, to see Moha and the other chiefs return wounded. Surely you have no regard for yourselves or your friends if you would leave off fighting. And Shongi says, It was the love of Charlie for his friends who were killed some time ago that was the cause of his death. But I think it starts a process of grieving. And he's not been able to grieve. He talks about having had a hard heart. And that people have to throw their hearts away to take up the Christian message of peace and love. So it's quite a powerful conversation that was happening, as you can see. Okay, so Henry Williams ends up by saying, "We can but speak to you. We wish to do you good and your children. We wish to teach your children as our own. We ask no payment. Is there any love in this?" And he says, some of you have visited our countries and have seen that people can read and write. This knowledge they pay a great price for. You have had things from us, but you only at this time, as we before told you, possess your lands. And this is where we need the font of irony, because we know what happened to their lands later on. And he goes on to say, there is a vessel now building by here. This was William Gilbert Puckey's father, was a boat builder from Cornwall and was busy building the Herald, a 55-foot schooner out of Kauri and of the wreckage of the Brampton, which had gone on the reef near Waitangi. And Henry Williams is trying to give them an idea of the vision he and Marsden have of the economy that Maori could join. He said, this would take your articles of trade to Port Jackson where you may dispose of them to good advantage. If you were to saw timber, the plank would there fetch a good price. If you were to cultivate your lands in a proper manner, you now have the advantage of doing, you may load the vessel with wheat, which article will also be sure to meet a good price. In the prosperity of other islands, you may see the nature of your own advantages. And Samuel Marsden, on his first meeting with Hongi, had spotted that Waimate was a great place, was the best land for growing wheat, and was sure that they needed to get some wheat growing and get a mill operating to turn it into flour, to give them an alternative, to give them food security, because they were eating fernwood, which worked. You know, they had their own methods, and they grew kumara, and they had their own pretty industrious attitude to agriculture, but they didn't have the technology to turn wheat into flour. And when they first grew wheat, they would pull it up out of the ground and say, well, you know, what the hell's going on? There's no kumara down the bottom here. And, you know, they didn't realise that the wheat grains were such a concentrated store of energy and protein. So, the context of all of this is that ultimately, in a matter of decades, Maori had given up warfare. You might have heard of the book, The Musket Wars. And you know, I think the Musket Wars is a complete misnomer. It distracts attention. You might as well call the Napoleonic Wars the Cannon Wars. You know? What was going on was there was this amazing cultural transition that Maori were going through from 1814 on. This is a picture that Richard Taylor drew of a house that Te Huhu had built in Tukana, and it's called Te Riri Kawareware, and that means the finishing of anger. And I don't think people recognise just how incredible it was that Maori, who'd been so warlike, actually adopted an ideology of peace to an extent we are still beginning to understand. So there was the war to peace transition that was happening. There was the oral to written transition, which is what is called the Homeric transition, where Homer was always spoken poetry, and Homer wrote it down. And this conversation is a spoken phenomenon, and its power is in the oratory, is in the rhetoric. Wheat and flour, which my next book is focused on, and how Richard Davis actually got a wheat mill going in Waimate, and how that then spread out through the rest of the country. It was quite a significant change, a transition. And the use of horse and water power completely transformed the whole economy and the whole society. So Maori were going through the Homeric transition of oral poetry to written literate culture, and through the agricultural and industrial revolutions, all telescoped into about 20, 30 years. It's incredible. And at the same time, painting and drawing and photography came in. And yet the culture that they cherished survived. Okay, so that's my talk, briefly. You might want to join me in singing this anthem. Do you know Te Aroha? So this is an anthem that was written recently, last century, and it means love, faith, and peace for all. So, Te Aroha, Te Whakapono, me te rangi Marie, tato tato e. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I was interested in your comment about the respect in using macrons. So the shongi, is that how it would have been said if it was transliterated that way?
It's how the missionaries were hearing it.
Yes.
And Maori is actually quite a sibilant language. So hongi is our, when we put it into
Yes.
written words,
Yeah.
it actually probably sounded like shongi.
Very interesting.
I know some people need to get away. So.
No, that's all right.
Maori needs to.
Actually, the government could do with some of Holly's advice about food sustainability now. Food security. And I think the transition, the oral to written, but there were, I think, 46 newspapers in Te Reo in the 1800s, the early 1900s. We have no idea. The actual ability and skill that happened so quickly.
Yeah. In Paki's letters and journals, there's a record of him visiting villages that he'd never visited before, and they were sitting around reading things he'd printed off, because they taught each other.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I have a question. Where's your book available?
It's at Schrodinger's.
Oh,
I have a few copies here.
During the presentation, you showed a number of people who had travelled during the early 1800s.
Yeah.
So it seems unusual to us, and we think, now, what would have been their motivation to want to go from there and travel to, like, Kenya?
Well, actually, many Maori had travelled. They jumped on whaling ships, and they travelled the world, and they'd become very useful as sailors. Shongi's motivation to go to London was to meet the king, and he did meet the king. And he was taken up by a family who had
connections with the Cambridge academia, and they brought him to London and hosted him there, and he sort of looked down his nose at the Church Missionary Society because they didn't give him any gifts or anything, but these people did. They treated him properly. They treated him with the respect that he felt he was due as the leading rangatira from the Ngāpuhi. And when he met King George IV, George IV was having a few troubles with Caroline, his wife, at that point. And Hongi had a discussion with him about, you know, yeah, he didn't have any trouble with any of his 3 wives, you know, but so yeah. And King George IV gave Hongi a suit of armour, breastplate and chainmail, helmet, and a whole lot of muskets. And some of those gifts he traded in for more muskets when he got back to Sydney. And he also did a deal with Baron Thierry, and it's all a bit murky about how exactly it happened, but he got a number more muskets and armed his friends. But the interesting thing, each musket, they used to carve the stocks expertly and they'd name them. So they weren't just killing things, they carried the names of the reason for fighting. And in my book, you'll find out what the reason Hongi had for fighting. And it was in response to an atrocity that his tribe had suffered earlier on.
It's interesting, it's just fascinated in how somebody from here, he would want to go and sort of meet the king. So there must have been a lot of other discussions or transfer of information for him to decide that he was a guy who had the nana and the standing that he wanted to go and meet him.
Yes.
So, I mean, so there's an awful lot of other historic communication must go on that we've never really heard much
Well, there's
about.
other books about other Maori visiting England as well and having a really hard time.
It's become a subject of some interest, isn't it? But one of the writers, I think it's Dorothy Clower, said he was going to London as a rangatira for rangatira purposes. You know?
Still the king is an equal,
Yeah.
I'm going to call on Gary to cover both things.
Right, thank you so much. Is this sideline over here for a second?
Okay, Gary. And then we'll get you to draw the grapple graph.
Oh.
Speaking of draw.
Yeah, this is fascinating to me. It wasn't until probably gone, well, I was well out of high school. Māori wasn't a subject available to us at that time, and certainly this type of history. And I did a te reo class. I did the kindergarten version, you know, the very first cab off the rank stuff. Went for a year, then COVID hit, and that sort of stymied it. But unintended consequence of learning the language was I started to get the history.
Yeah.
And I'm going to cry here. It's just astounding.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at it, you think, my God, that's and I've had friends say to me, you can't put right the wrongs of 200 years ago. And I said to the one guy in particular, well, it's still going on today. And if you open your eyes and see what's in the news, you know, people look at it, oh, this just has bloody Maoris again, you know. But when you look behind it, it's exactly the same, And you know, and this is brilliant. I do a little side thing, you know, being retired, cruise ships, and taking out a lot of Americans in particular because they're very inquisitive. And always open up with not a karakia. I mean, I'm not sort of that way inclined, but you know, big welcome, and then and off we go. And then they all ask the questions. But I've got a good mate, Mike Bolton. Well, he's a car salesman. He's made up all sorts of crap that he spins it, and everyone in the room will know about him. And musket wars in particular, but then when all the little pieces start coming together, oh my God, actually this is the story, you know. It's really fascinating. I do need your book. Thank you for coming to talk to us. A little gift from us.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's
You
lovely.
know, some of you recognise all
I
that. That's
do,
right.
yeah, no, that's marvellous.
You thank Grant in the usual fashion.
Thank you.
Cheers.
The line of turns on the old, that's fabulous. Thank you so much, I really appreciate
Nearly
it.
saved.
Nearly
Oh,
saved.
nearly saved. Now, we're going to enjoy a piece of birthday cake. We should have to sing first, Who's going to lead that?
The Conservative mind.